Hello lads, ladies, gents, ladettes, whoever, whatever, welcome back to another video. I'm sure just about all of us at one point or another remember playing with those little green plastic army figures. Being a staple of many a child's toy box, the Army Men have had a long and storied history within pop culture thanks to their popularity. Being created by Virgin Toys Novelty Company back in 1938, they have managed to make it onto Time magazine's top 100 popular toys of all time. Being so popular in fact that not only did they manage to make it into movies like Toy Story, they managed to get their own video game series, consisting of over 20 different titles. The Army Men series could basically be found on every platform at the time, releasing all the way up to the Nintendo Wii. Bouncing between different genres and developers, the series released the vast majority of its games in the first 4 years span of its life. And in this span, we got a little sub-series known as Sarge's Hero, which is the focus of today's video. Being developed and published by 3DO and releasing for the Nintendo 64, PlayStation, Dreamcast, and Windows between late 1999 and 2000, Sarge's Heroes went on to sell over 1.3 million copies, being one of the better selling in the entire series. And although it didn't get critics too excited at the time, it was a game that was mostly fondly remembered by fans. The Green Army that are led by Colonel Grimm are at war with the Tan Army, who have kidnapped Grimm's daughter Vicky, the oddly human looking one.
Jesus Christ.
Also, the Tan Army have discovered portals to the human world, granting them access to weapons that are basically nothing more than everyday items to you or me, but could be considered dangerous to plastic soldiers. The introduction of these portals also allow for some pretty creative level design, going from what would seem like a more traditional battlefield, somewhat European inspired at least by looking at the buildings, to a more human world taking place where a kid might typically be playing with these toys. This to me gives the game the illusion of almost being inspired by a child's imagination rather than a fictional world that's just taking place at the same time. And we don't see any humans, so at least to me this feels like something that is implied. However, how you want to interpret it is your decision. This is my personal interpretation because I don't think this is meant to be a Toy Story-like situation. However, if it was, that'd be pretty sick. To get back on topic about the levels, you'll notice that they can be somewhat large, which is really cool. However, at least in the version that I am playing, which is the Dreamcast version, the draw distance, although very impressive, can make the games feel somewhat barren. Although there are plenty of enemies around and plenty of buildings, there is lots of just dead space, and that can make the game kinda suffer. It makes the somewhat slow movement a little bit more noticeable, especially at a time when we're used to playing games like Doom where you'd run around at a million miles an hour. Please watch my Doom video, it's my favourite video I've ever made, and here, have a snippet of it. Now let's get back on track and talk about the game's visuals. The first thing to note is the game's colours. They absolutely pop off the screen and really enforce the idea of this being a child's imagination, while also being a joy to look at. The character models have also aged incredibly well, and even though they're based on a child's toy and not after a real human, I think the artists have done a phenomenal job in creating them. The only complaint I have is the lack of overall variety when it comes to enemy designs, but that is solely through a modern lens and by no means a fault of the game, as at the time it's pretty common and even still to this day to have enemies look a certain way to determine what type they are, such as a machine gunner, grenader, etc. Beyond all that, you will notice the game's texture work is pretty good, with only the ground and wall textures being a bit of a weak point, which was pretty common for the time and even today, which means for the time the game's presentation is second to pretty much none. And sure, it probably reuses some assets from some of the previous games in the series, but look at the Resident Evil remakes, they do it, so why can't Army Men? Being a third-person shooter, Sarge's Hero plays pretty much how you would expect for a game of its time. Being mostly a running gun, there isn't much use for cover here. Although you can use it to avoid shots from tanks, RPGs and grenades, the odds are you're going to be running around and just hope you don't get hit. It's very much a shoot first and ask questions later type of game. You'll get a pretty good variety of weapons here, as you get to pick from M16s, sniper rifles, RPGs and many more. The weapons will give you enough variety to tackle enemies going ahead, so it doesn't get too stale. It isn't without its faults however, mainly the fact that the game doesn't have a ton of direct input as to how you shoot, as it will auto-target enemies. Sure, you do technically have an aiming mode, but it isn't particularly great, so it's something if this game was to get a remake, I would love to see touched up. Also, I mentioned it feels a bit slow in terms of the movement due to the size of the levels, but the movement itself, although relatively okay, does feel a bit stiff. This rigid movement can make things feel extra slow when you're trying to make precise movements. The best example I can give is when you're using the sniper rifle to take out enemies. You'll drop to the ground, crawl forward and shoot. However, this is where another problem actually arises. You might not have anything in the way of the reticule, but when you shoot, you will find that you're just shooting the ground because the geometry is actually blocking your shot, which means the aiming isn't quite as accurate as it leads you to believe, which is sadly the tale of Sarge's Heroes. It's a lot of minor things that seem to hold it back from being practically perfect for what it is. Not to say that it was set out to be a 10 out of 10 greatest game ever made, but it definitely doesn't quite reach its full potential. I mentioned being a little disappointed by the lack of enemy design variety, but the overall different enemy types themselves is somewhat decent. You'll have everything you would expect from machine gunners to grenaders to tanks. However, this is where a little bit more disappointment does seep in, and that is the fact, even though in theory there is enough enemy variety to theoretically have an ever-evolving gameplay loop, Sarge's Heroes falls a bit flat. This is because every encounter you run into, whether it be a tank, grenader, or machine gunner, plays out pretty much the same, thanks to the auto-aim system. It turns out to be just run, gun, pray. Basically the redneck version of live, laugh, love. The first tank you fight is definitely an adrenaline rush, but once you understand how they work, they're not really anything different from just the run-of-the-mill tan soldier. Best way I can put it is imagine playing Left 4 Dead, but you only have regular zombies. No special zombies, so no tanks, hunters, or anything else of that line. Sure, it'll be fun to play for 5 to 10 minutes at a time, but it just doesn't have that special quality to lift it above and beyond and have that real staying power. But I don't think it was designed to have that staying power. Consisting of 16 levels, the game could take around 5 to 8 hours depending on how quick you want to run through things, which for what it is, I actually think is the perfect length.
That's what she said!
The game's sound design is the last thing I want to touch on today. It has me in two minds overall, as I feel the design is a little weak, but it is also me ignoring the fact that the game is probably trying to replicate the sounds that you would expect from a toy. This means they definitely lack a lot of punch and can feel a little bit flat or a little bit thin. It's by no means a deal breaker or honestly something I think that detracts from the overall experience. It's just one of those things I think a remake would help elevate the game that extra step to stand out amongst its peers. The OST does stand out well enough, and it is something that I think is worth having a listen to, but it's not something you would necessarily go out of your way to listen to. As I've said many times before, the soundtrack does what it should do. It services the game and not itself. Being pretty much what you would expect, the game oozes the idea of the American military. And its use of these military themes makes it feel like something you would expect to hear on a morning cartoon, more so than something you would actually hear from the actual military. Which kind of goes to what I was saying earlier about the game feeling like it was taking place in a kid's imagination. Now, I said several times throughout this video that a remake or remaster would help elevate this game, basically to be the perfect version of itself, and I would love to see a remake or remaster of this entire series, not necessarily just Sarge's Heroes, but the Army Men in general. Although we have seen a few toy-based shooters start to pop up, I do miss the Army Men series as a whole. And even though I've been critical of this game overall, it is just missing those little 1%ers to make it something truly special. So with that, lads, ladies, gents, ladettes, whoever, whatever, it brings us to the end of another video. I'd like to thank you so much for watching. If you have any history with the Army Men game, let me know down below. If you like this video, please consider hitting like. If you want to go a little bit further, you can hit that subscribe button. If you want to go that extra mile, however, and you want to support me directly, you can actually sign up for Ko-fi, which is $1 a month, and you'll get a little bit of behind the scenes stuff and your name thrown up at the end of every video. Thank you so much for watching once again. Stay safe out there. Bye.